A German child in Berlin looks up at the sky on a clear day in 1944 and sees something that turns her blood cold. Hundreds, maybe thousands of silver aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon in tight formations. The drone of their engines is so loud it drowns out every other sound. She's been told the Americans are weak, that they can't sustain bombing raids, that German fighters will protect the fatherland. But looking at this armada filling the sky like a mechanical storm, she knows the adults have been lying. The air raid sirens start wailing, and she runs for the shelter, already hearing the whistle of falling bombs. This is the story of how Nazi Germany went from mocking American air power to watching helplessly as American bombers systematically destroyed their ability to wage war. How did the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, lose control of its own skies? And how did American industry and courage create an air campaign that sealed Germany's fate? Let's start with what the Nazis actually thought about American air power before the war really began. German military planners and propaganda had a specific view of America that colored all their assessments. They saw America as soft, industrial yet not militaristic, rich yet undisciplined. They believed American society was too individualistic and pleasure-seeking to produce the kind of hardened warriors that Germany had cultivated. This wasn't just propaganda for German civilians. German military leadership genuinely believed these things. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, famously boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. He felt the Luftwaffe was invincible and that American attempts at strategic bombing would be unsuccessful. This confidence was partly based on real German success. The Luftwaffe had played a crucial role in Germany's early victories. In Poland, France, and the early campaigns in the Soviet Union, German air power had demonstrated effectiveness that shocked the world. German pilots were experienced, their tactics were refined, and their aircraft were competitive with those of the Allies. When Germany assessed American air power in 1941 and 1942, it observed an air force that was expanding rapidly but lacked the combat experience and tactical sophistication of the Luftwaffe. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong, but it missed crucial factors that would prove decisive. The Germans particularly underestimated American industrial capacity and organizational ability. They knew American factories could produce aircraft in large numbers, but they didn't grasp the scale or efficiency that American mass production would achieve. They also didn't understand how quickly American pilots and crews would learn and adapt in combat. The Nazi worldview, poisoned by racial ideology, made them believe Americans couldn't possibly match German military excellence. This arrogance would cost them everything. But before we get to that, let's talk about what the Americans were actually building while the Germans were mocking them. The B-17 Flying Fortress was conceived in the 1930s as a strategic bomber designed to defend America's coasts by attacking enemy fleets far at sea. But by the time World War II started, American strategic doctrine had evolved. The B-17 would be used for strategic bombing, attacking the enemy's industrial capacity and infrastructure deep inside their territory. The idea was that destroying factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and other strategic targets would cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. This was controversial even among Allied planners. The British favored area bombing at night, essentially carpet bombing cities. The Americans wanted precision daylight bombing of specific targets. The debate wasn't just tactical. It was about what kind of war to wage and how much civilian suffering was acceptable. The B-17 was designed for this precision daylight bombing mission. It flew at an altitude of around 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where it was harder for fighters and anti-aircraft guns to reach it. It featured the Norden bombsight, a sophisticated analog computer that theoretically enabled precise bombing from high altitudes. And crucially, it was heavily armed with machine guns for self-defense. The Flying Fortress name came from these defensive guns. Early B-17s had multiple gun positions to defend against fighters attacking from any angle. The theory was that B-17s flying in tight formation could create overlapping fields of fire, making it difficult for fighters to attack them successfully. This theory would be put to the test in combat. American bomber production ramped up slowly at first, but then exploded. By 1944, American factories were producing B-17s at rates that seemed impossible. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were churning out hundreds of bombers per month. This wasn't just about money and resources. This was about American industrial culture that emphasized efficiency, standardization, and mass production. The same techniques Henry Ford used to build cars were being applied to building bombers. Workers became specialists in specific tasks. Assembly lines moved aircraft through stations where different components were installed. The process was continually optimized to increase speed and reduce waste. Germans could build quality aircraft, but they were unable to match American production rates. The first American bombers arrived in England in 1942 to join the 8th Air Force. The early raids were small, testing tactics and building experience. German defenders initially weren't particularly worried. Small formations of American bombers were attacking targets in occupied France, not Germany itself. The raids caused some damage, but nothing catastrophic. German propaganda portrayed these raids as ineffective and claimed heavy American losses even when that wasn't true. However, by late 1942 and into 1943, the raids were becoming larger and penetrating deeper into German-controlled territory. The Americans were learning fast. The devastating raids really began in 1943 when American bomber forces had built up sufficient strength and experience. Now we're talking about raids with hundreds of bombers attacking strategic targets deep inside Germany. The Germans responded with aggressive fighter attacks and heavy anti-aircraft fire. The losses on both sides were terrible. American bomber crews had one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. A B-17 crew had to complete 25 missions before they could go home, and the odds of surviving that many missions were frighteningly low in 1943. German fighter pilots were being killed at unsustainable rates as well. But here's the crucial difference. America could replace its losses. Germany increasingly couldn't. Let me paint a picture of what these raids looked like from the ground. Imagine you're a German civilian in a city targeted for bombing. First, you hear the sirens. Then, if it's daytime and the weather is clear, you might see them. Formations of B-17s, flying in what they called combat boxes, tight groups designed to maximize defensive firepower. A large raid might have 300 or 400 bombers, and they're flying so high they look like tiny silver crosses against the blue sky. The contrails from their engines stretch across the sky in perfectly straight lines. It's strangely beautiful and absolutely terrifying because you know what's coming. The drone of their engines builds until it's deafening. Then you hear the whistling shriek of falling bombs. From the bomber crew's perspective, these missions were hell. You're flying at high altitude where the temperature is far below zero. You're wearing oxygen masks because the air is too thin to breathe. You're in constant danger from German fighters and anti-aircraft fire, called flak. The flak bursts around you, black puffs of smoke that mean shrapnel is tearing through the air. If flak hits your plane, it can shred aluminum, destroy engines, and kill crew members. If fighters attack, you're firing your guns at them while hoping their cannons don't hit you. If your plane is hit badly enough, you might have to bail out, and that means parachuting into enemy territory, where you'll be captured if you survive. Many crews didn't survive. The worst period for American bomber crews was the fall of 1943. Raids deep into Germany were happening regularly, but losses were terrible. The raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 is infamous. American bombers attacked ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt, a crucial target because ball bearings were essential for German war production. But the raid cost 60 B-17s destroyed and hundreds of crew killed or captured. That's a loss rate of over 20%. Numbers like that aren't sustainable. If you lose 20% of your force every mission, you run out of bombers and crews very quickly. The Germans knew this, and they believed the Americans would have to stop the daylight bombing campaign. But the Germans didn't understand American determination or industrial capacity. The Americans temporarily halted deep penetration raids after Schweinfurt, but only to prepare for something bigger. The problem was fighter escort. B-17s could defend themselves to some extent, but they were vulnerable to determined fighter attacks. The solution was long-range fighter escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a capable aircraft, but it had limited range. The P-38 Lightning was fast, but had problems. The P-51 Mustang, when equipped with drop tanks and the British Merlin engine, became the answer. The P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Once the Mustang arrived in numbers in early 1944, everything changed. Now German fighters had to deal with American fighters that were faster and more maneuverable. The Luftwaffe began losing fighters and pilots at a rate they couldn't replace. By the spring of 1944, the Americans were launching raids with over 1,000 bombers supported by hundreds of fighters. The scale was overwhelming. Germany's air defenses, formidable as they were, couldn't stop raids of this magnitude. Some bombers would be shot down. Some targets would be missed. But enough bombers would get through to cause massive damage. And the raids kept coming. Day after day, sometimes multiple raids per day. German industry was being systematically destroyed. Oil refineries burned. Aircraft factories were bombed into rubble. Transportation networks were wrecked. Ball bearing production was crippled despite the heavy costs of the earlier Schweinfurt raids. The psychological impact on German civilians was enormous. Nazi propaganda had promised them victory, had told them the homeland was safe, and had assured them the Luftwaffe would protect them. Now they were watching American bombers fly over German cities in broad daylight with seeming impunity. Yes, some were shot down, but hundreds more would get through. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. People saw with their own eyes that their government had been lying. This didn't turn most Germans against the Nazi regime immediately, but it planted seeds of doubt and despair that would grow. For the Luftwaffe, the situation became desperate. They were losing experienced pilots at a faster rate than they could train replacements. Fuel was increasingly scarce because American bombers kept hitting oil production facilities. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses, even though Germany was producing more fighters than ever. The experienced veterans who'd fought since 1939 or 1940 were mostly dead by 1944. The replacement pilots were often teenagers with minimal training being sent up against experienced American bomber gunners and fighter pilots. It was a slaughter. Some German pilots survived their first missions. Many didn't. German commanders tried various tactical responses. They experimented with heavy fighter armament that could destroy bombers from beyond the range of defensive guns. They attempted mass formation attacks where dozens of fighters would simultaneously attack a bomber formation. They developed specialized anti-bomber fighters. Some of these tactics achieved local successes, but nothing could stop the overall American air campaign. The numbers were against Germany. Even successful German interceptions that shot down dozens of American bombers didn't matter strategically because America would replace those bombers and crews within days. Germany couldn't replace its losses at anything close to that rate. By D-Day in June 1944, the Allies had essentially achieved air superiority over Western Europe. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe was almost completely absent. German soldiers on the ground later recalled looking up and seeing nothing but Allied aircraft. Where was the Luftwaffe? It had been destroyed or driven from the skies by the combined weight of American and British air power. American B-17s and other bombers had been crucial in this. They destroyed aircraft factories, killed German pilots, bombed airfields, and struck the infrastructure that sustained the Luftwaffe. By the time the invasion occurred, German air power had become a shadow of its former self. The strategic bombing campaign continued through late 1944 and into 1945. By this point, German industry was in ruins. Oil production had been reduced to a trickle. Transportation networks were so damaged that even when factories produced something, it couldn't be moved to where it was needed. German civilians were living in the rubble of bombed cities. The industrial capacity that had sustained Germany's war effort was gone. This didn't end the war immediately. German soldiers continued fighting with incredible determination in many cases. But they were fighting without adequate supplies, fuel, ammunition, or air support. The outcome was inevitable. There's a debate among historians about the effectiveness and morality of the strategic bombing campaign. Some argue that destroying German industry made it impossible for Germany to sustain the war. Others argue the impact was less than claimed, that German production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, and that the enormous cost in aircrew lives and resources might have been better used elsewhere. The moral questions are even more complicated. Strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The distinction between military and civilian targets is often blurred. Area bombing of cities, especially the British night raids, was essentially terrorizing the civilian population. However, from a purely military perspective, the American bombing campaign ultimately achieved its objectives. German industry was destroyed. The Luftwaffe was defeated. German forces lacked the supplies and support needed to fight effectively, and the psychological impact was significant. German morale collapsed as people saw their cities destroyed and their government unable to protect them. Whether this justified the cost in lives, both Allied aircrew and German civilians, is a moral question that doesn't have an easy answer. What's undeniable is that the campaign was successful in military terms, and by 1945, German mockery of American air power seemed like a cruel joke. Let's discuss the human element, as these raids were conducted by real people on both sides. American bomber crews were often very young, guys in their late teens and early 20s. They volunteered for this knowing it was perilous. The camaraderie in bomber crews was intense because they depended on each other for survival. The pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunners became like a family. When a plane was shot down, it wasn't just the loss of an aircraft. It was the loss of 10 friends. Survivor's guilt was common among crew members whose friends didn't make it back. German fighter pilots faced their own trauma. Many of them were defending their homeland, watching their cities burn, knowing their families were in danger below. They fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. Some became aces, shooting down dozens of Allied aircraft. But even the successful pilots knew they were losing. The numbers were against them. Every mission might be their last. Some pilots were shot down multiple times and kept flying. Others were killed on their first mission. The randomness and brutality of it all were psychologically devastating. German civilians who survived the raids lived with trauma that lasted their entire lives. Imagine being in a bomb shelter while the earth shakes from explosions overhead. The lights go out. Dust and smoke fill the air. You don't know if your home is being destroyed, if your family members in other shelters are alive, or if you'll be buried alive. When the all-clear sounds and you emerge, you might find your entire neighborhood gone, bodies in the rubble. Fires are burning everywhere, the smell of smoke and death. People who lived through this, especially children, carried psychological scars forever. Some never spoke about it. Others couldn't stop talking about it. All were changed. The post-war reckoning with strategic bombing has been a complex process. Germany, having started the war and committed genocide on an industrial scale, had limited moral standing to complain about Allied bombing. But individual German civilians who suffered and died in air raids were victims too. The morality of war is a complex and uncomfortable subject. The Allied bombing campaign included genuinely strategic targeting of military and industrial facilities. It also included deliberate destruction of civilian areas designed to break morale. We can acknowledge both that the campaign contributed to defeating Nazi Germany and that it involved tremendous suffering for people who had little control over their government's actions. The B-17 and other American bombers became symbols of American power. The sight of massive bomber formations became a testament to American industrial might and determination. The Germans had mocked the American capacity to wage war effectively. The bomber streams over Germany proved them catastrophically wrong. American industry could produce war material at scales that shocked everyone. American crews could fight with courage and effectiveness that contradicted Nazi racial theories about American weakness. American planners could organize and sustain campaigns of unprecedented complexity. All the Nazi assumptions about American inadequacy proved false. By war's end, American bomber production totaled tens of thousands of aircraft. B-17 production alone exceeded 12,000 aircraft. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy conducted thousands of missions. Over 350,000 American aircrew served in the air war against Germany. Casualties were heavy. Roughly 26,000 American airmen were killed in action in the European theater. That's approximately the same number of Marines killed in all of the Pacific island hopping campaigns. The air war was brutally costly, but it achieved its objectives. Germany's industrial capacity and air force were severely damaged, significantly contributing to the Allied victory. So what's the ultimate lesson from this story? The most obvious one is not to underestimate your opponents. Nazi Germany made catastrophic errors in assessing American capabilities. They believed their own propaganda about American weakness and paid a terrible price for that delusion. However, there's a deeper lesson to be learned about industrial warfare. In modern conflicts, industrial capacity often outweighs martial valor. German pilots were skilled and brave. German aircraft were sophisticated. But none of that mattered when America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The B-17's blackening the sky represented unstoppable industrial power more than any individual tactical superiority. There's also a lesson about moral complexity in war. The strategic bombing campaign helped defeat Nazi Germany, one of history's most evil regimes. That's good. But it involved killing enormous numbers of civilians and causing suffering that echoes through generations. That's good. We can hold both truths simultaneously. War creates impossible moral situations where every choice involves terrible consequences. The bomber crews were criminals. They were young men doing what they were ordered to do to defeat an evil regime. But the suffering they inflicted was real and shouldn't be forgotten or minimized. The Nazi mockery of American air power, confident declarations that German skies were inviolable, all of it proved hollow when confronted with American determination and industrial might. The B-17s that blackened German skies represented more than military hardware. They represented a fundamental truth about World War II. The Axis powers made catastrophic miscalculations about Allied capabilities, particularly those of the United States. Those miscalculations, rooted in arrogance and ideology, cost them everything. By the time German civilians and leaders understood the truth, it was far too late. The bombers just kept coming, day after day, until there was nothing left to bomb. If this exploration of the air war over Germany gave you a new perspective on how the Allies achieved victory, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're bringing you the strategic realities, the human stories, and the complex truths about World War II that shaped our modern world. Thank you for watching. Remember, the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate.